Hi, everyone, and welcome to Free Press Livestream. My name is Rafaela, and I'm so glad to be joined by our Middle East analyst, Haviv Rettig Gur, to talk about all things ceasefire in Gaza. Haviv, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here, Rafaela.
So let's just dive right in. At this point, the ceasefire in Gaza has broken down now twice, first on the 19th, then just a few days ago on the 28th, and then it has been reestablished twice. And everyone is now sort of wondering, is this a lasting ceasefire? And of course, will phase 2 of Trump's 20-point peace plan actually proceed? So I want to talk about first what's happened in the past 48 hours. Overnight, going into Wednesday, Israel began striking at different points in Gaza, different Hamas targets, after, of course, accusing Hamas of violating the ceasefire and killing an IDF reservist soldier. Haviv, can you tell us what happened that led to these strikes this week?
Yeah, on Tuesday, a group of a sniper belonging to some Palestinian faction, the Israelis believe it's Hamas, shot and killed an Israeli reservist, an Israeli soldier. And the Israeli Air Force began to strike mostly specific positions in the area around those soldiers that could have been used by snipers and some tunnel shafts. And Hamas announced between Tuesday and Wednesday, roughly, several different things, actually. At first, it said that the attack wasn't from Hamas, it was another group. It accused a group, Abu Shabab militia at one point, which is a group that works with the Israeli army. And then Hamas admitted that it was their group, but it is it is a cell that had lost communication contact, and so it couldn't control them. And all of these messages went out. None of them really mattered to the Israelis. There was a series of airstrikes, by the way, publicly backed by the American administration. And as soon as the back and forth was over, the ceasefire essentially is back in effect. I can't find a single Israeli that takes anything out of Hamas seriously. Was it Hamas? Was it not Hamas? People would not be shooting at IDF soldiers with sniper rifles if not for Hamas's permission. It was Hamas testing what Israel was willing to do. Now, yeah.
And this other question about, just to clarify a bit, the idea is that there are some Hamas terrorists that are isolated. And the idea is that the tunnel network has been disrupted in a way that there are portions of the tunnel that are still intact, but do not have a line of communication to Hamas leadership. And therefore, there are these Hamas fighters that are basically stuck. And the claim is that they're sitting there either waiting to be discovered by the IDF, that they are sitting there waiting to starve. Obviously, there's not food coming into these remote tunnels that are cut off, or that they can die in combat. And so Hamas is saying that they didn't give the orders, but that they're just sort of stuck here with these options. Do you buy that that's actually happening?
I cannot actually say with any real, if you ask me, do I know something? I don't know any. I don't know. I have a very hard time imagining that that's even remotely what's going on. For one thing, Hamas have cell phones, and they're communicating just incredibly well, incredibly coordinated fashion. When the ceasefire was declared, it happened everywhere all at once. And so everything we've seen, when Hamas wants to be in control, it's in total control. And when Hamas wants to test the boundaries and test the responses of others, then it pretends to not be in total control. That's very strange. Also, it's, just to your point about supplies, we have yet to see a Hamas fighter come out of a tunnel who isn't well fed, who isn't well supplied, who didn't pass through the last 2 years happy and healthy. And that's distinct from, in certain areas of Gaza, not all obviously, but in certain areas of Gaza, as distinct from the civilian population. So I don't think, how shall I put this? Yesterday at the Council on Foreign Relations, the Qatari foreign minister, the major government in the region supporting Hamas, said that it was pretty clear to them publicly on television that it's Hamas, that those were Hamas fighters. And he said the Hamas claims that they were out of Hamas's control and out of communication. We don't know. We shall see, he said. So if the Qataris don't believe Hamas on this, and he then said it was very disappointing and very frustrating, and he laid the blame directly on Hamas. I simply don't know anyone outside of obviously the activists on Twitter. I don't know anybody who thinks this is honest on Hamas's part. They were testing the
Mhm.
Israeli resolve and what the ceasefire means, and what they got was a massive round of Israeli airstrikes, and I suspect that they're going to have that for a long time now. It's worth saying, what Hamas wants to accomplish in Gaza right now with the ceasefire is essentially to create a Lebanon situation where Hezbollah was able to build a massive army, take missiles and funding from its patron Iran, and never actually have responsibility of governance. But it was the major military force in the country, so it had all the ability to do violence anywhere, to control anything it wanted, without the responsibility of actually being the government of the place. Hamas, instead of being the government and therefore responsible for Gaza and therefore blamed by many Gazans for having brought Gaza to this place, would like to be Hezbollah in Lebanon. It would like to be the militia that everybody has to listen to because it can kill you, and it's shown that it can kill Palestinians anywhere in Gaza, while not being responsible. The trouble with, and I'll just finish with this, the trouble with the Lebanon model for Gaza is that the Israelis are also eager for the Lebanon model. The Lebanon model at this moment, after Israel decided to finally push back on Hezbollah after over a year of the slow demolition of Israeli towns and cities in the north, I think in the town of Metula, 1/3 of the homes are destroyed from rocket fire over the course of this sort of slow moving rocket fire of Hezbollah over that year.
Mhm.
Now, after the ceasefire with Hezbollah is still not allowed to have fighters, still not allowed to arm, still not allowed to have caches of missiles and rockets. And every time the IDF finds them, it bombs them. 300 Hezbollah fighters have been killed since the ceasefire, about an average of one a day. That probably is what Israel wants in Gaza going forward. As long as Hamas holds the ground, the Israelis will have, under the framework of a ceasefire, meaning not a return to war, but a
Mhm.
targeted intelligence war to take out capabilities and continue to suppress Hamas over time. That's basically what we're seeing shape up in Gaza right now.
It definitely changes what, the word ceasefire or the norm of ceasefire, I think, means for a lot of people, and we're gonna get into that. Before we even get there, Israel's strikes marked the deadliest day in Gaza since the ceasefire began on October 10th. In your view, was this response that we just saw in the past 2 days the right response?
I have no idea who died.
Mhm.
I simply don't. We There's no reason to think, when there's a suicide bombing or October 7 or something on the Israeli side, it takes hours, it can take a couple of days, it can take a couple of weeks to find out exactly who died, how many died, who they were, what's
Right.
when people die in Gaza. Now, a lot of people have died in Gaza. I'm not questioning the basic truth of the numbers. There's been a huge debates about this. I think
Mhm.
at this point we have a fairly good idea. There's a disagreements. There's infinite propaganda, obviously, but we have a basic good idea. People on both sides generally agree on the general death toll, but not immediately. If there's a death toll and within an hour everybody knows the exact number, they didn't count. And so I simply don't know who died. We have reports that children have died. 30 or over 30 children have died. We don't know if that's true. We don't have those numbers. The lists that are produced, that can be checked against Israeli population lists that Israeli intelligence has, is something that's going to be happening in 3 months. We simply don't know. Now, if the strikes were random, which is the accusation by the Palestinian activists, then of course not. That is absolutely not a useful response, and it's not an appropriate response, and it's not a moral response, and it may not be a legal response. But if the strikes targeted the 6 tunnel entrances in that area that Hamas had dug into the tunnel system in that particular area, mainly because if you send a soldier out of a fighter, a terrorist, but when they're attacking soldiers, they're not terrorists. If you send a sniper out of a tunnel, we're going to bomb all the tunnels in that area. If that's the Israeli attitude, then it's completely appropriate, and it's appropriate even if there's collateral damage. And again, the question is how much. So I don't I don't know, and the numbers are not trustworthy in the immediate aftermath of an event, and so I simply can't, judge that.
And while the numbers are not trustworthy, I think it's worth noting that, CNN, NBC, MSNBC, New York Times are all using the headline of 100 killed, which is, of course, a Hamas number. Um, I mean, this has been, you and I have talked about this a lot in the past. a
you know,
fixture of this war. And then, some of these news outlets are also saying more than 40 children and 20 women. Um, but
and I just,
it's, it's
it's worth saying the number, the final number that people are kind of agreeing on from different sides, it's within an order of magnitude of the truth, okay? But it has moved up and down by thousands, essentially based on just Hamas say so. I mean, it's not, yes, these numbers are not trustworthy. If you want to measure the general war, you can have a good idea. If you want to measure a specific operation, a specific day, and to know, was this okay? Was this not okay? You simply can't know. You simply cannot know. All the mechanisms on the ground in Gaza are essentially controlled by Hamas or by people who deeply support Hamas. Hamas tried to check if it can begin to kill Israeli soldiers under the framework of the ceasefire. The Israeli answer is no. How many people, how many civilians were killed in that moment, in that Israeli response? We're not going to know for a very long time. And by the way, I don't. I say this. This hurts me to say this, but the people running that news report in mainstream Western press, not just in the New York Times and in the, you know, in London, in Paris, and in Berlin, they don't generally care that much about whether it's later corrected, right? The corrections are always issued in a very marginal place. The important thing is to run with the number produced on the ground in Gaza, which is obviously a number meant to convey a political message related to the war. So um,
why
don't trust
haven't
the
why
number.
haven't Western media outlets understood that at this point, 2 years later?
I mean, I hate to say it. I don't. I honestly don't think that the culture in Western media is all that worried about it.
Hmm.
I know some of these reporters. Let me let me say it more broadly. A great deal of what afflicts Western societies at the moment, the media is struggling to tell those stories in ways that are not just partisan and shallow and narrow and ideologically framed. It's not just Israel and Gaza. This sort of dismissal of, the famous example, and there's hundreds of examples like it, but it's really the big egregious one was that Al-Ahli hospital bombing a year ago, where instantly they knew 500 were dead, and it wasn't 500, and it wasn't an Israeli airstrike, and it was almost none of the facts that ran and everywhere in the global press were true. And it took hours, and there was resistance, and there was anger and bitterness that they themselves had gotten it wrong. But I don't know. The free press was founded by people who are frustrated with the fact that Hunter Biden's laptop, something totally outside my wheelhouse that I don't understand at all, please don't learn up from me anything about it. It turned out 2 years after it mattered that it was a very significant issue, and everybody in the press that I ever read on that issue told me it's a silly Republican conspiracy theory. Incidentally, it's also true in the other direction. Okay, the press is so deeply partisan, so deeply believing that it is the front line, the vanguard of culture wars, and this is happening everywhere with the general partisanship and polarization of societies in the West because of social media algorithms and all the rest. It's happening to the media in Germany. It's happening to the media in France. Okay. But it's happening everywhere. So I don't find in these places a culture that's actually really eager and hungry to get it right. It's 100 dead, and they're probably all civilians, and that's all there is to know. Now, if it's 50-50, that's a legitimate airstrike. And if it's 3 to 97, that's not a legitimate airstrike. And if the 100 dead is actually 32 dead and nobody's bothering to actually count, because who's going to count on the ground? All of these questions nobody's bothering with in any of the newsrooms of the West. And it's not just Gaza, it's on every issue that Western societies face, I think. It's not a great time for journalism.
Mm. Getting back to what's happening on the ground, do you think that there is anything that could actually deter Hamas from firing at IDF installations? Obviously, we saw the strike. I'm curious to know if you think that in and of itself is deterrence, but what deters Hamas at this point?
No, Hamas fundamentally is undeterrable. That at least is the takeaway of the Israelis. No Israeli thinks Hamas is deterrable. That's the lesson from October 7. If they're willing to bring this war into Gaza, and this is the war they planned for, that's why they built the most comprehensive bomb shelter system in the history of warfare, that tunnel system, and not a single Gazan child has been allowed into it in 2 years. You can love the Israelis, you can hate the Israelis. The fact is, Hamas built a war in which Gaza's destruction was a foundational premise of the war. And so no, they're literally undeterrable. I mean, there's just nothing that can happen, not to them, not to Gaza, that will deter them. And that, what we're seeing, what's interesting is the transformation that has come over the Israelis. And it's not just in Gaza, it's also in Iran, it's also in Lebanon. The enemy is undeterrable to the point of pursuing the self-destruction of their own polity in the pursuit of the destruction of Israel, because they have this grand narrative of religious redemption. It's not a political war in their view, it's a redemptionist religious war. And therefore, the only solution is permanent suppression. And that's what you're seeing in South Lebanon. No monsters will grow on the border, is something that reporters have heard from Israeli military strategists and planners again and again and again over the last 2 years. And that's probably what you're going to see in Gaza. The Israelis have essentially now, this first phase of the Trump peace plan, where Israel pulled out of half of Gaza, Hamas immediately came out of the tunnels and retook the other half, the half that Israel pulled out of. You basically now have two Gazas, one under the umbrella of the Israeli military, and one now basically controlled by Hamas after it went after, in tremendous gun battles and quite a few dead, it went after all of its political opponents. And now you have two Gazas, where one is a place where Israel is going to constantly be suppressing Hamas. Hamas is constantly going to be testing the Israelis. And the other one is behind the Israeli military line.
I want to get into that sort of two-state reality that's developing within the Gaza Strip. First, I just want to take a beat on the remaining deceased hostages that are still in Gaza, or excuse me, Hamas-controlled territory. The, you know, skirmish over the past few days wasn't just because of Hamas's attack on the IDF in Rafah. It was also that, Hamas was supposed to return all of the living and deceased hostages within 72 hours of the peace deal being signed, which was on October 10th. Of course, they didn't return any hostages in that first 72-hour window. We now have all of the living hostages back on Israeli soil, which is a blessing. But, or excuse me, sorry, they didn't return any of the dead hostages in the 72 hours. However, there's still 13 deceased hostages trapped in Gaza under Hamas, supervision. They say they don't know where all of them are. Um, and then we had this video emerge that was really just brutal to watch. It essentially showed, and correct me if I'm missing the characterization here, but they took a body bag, basically took it out, threw it under sand, and then pretended to rediscover it in front of the Red Cross. Um, so obviously that goes to show, they know where some of these bodies are and are pretending to rediscover them under pretend rubble. Um, what do you make of all of this? Like, do they know where all of the deceased hostages are?
Yes. Hamas has nothing, no leverage, no asset more valuable than Israel's living hostages. It invested everything in it. It held on to them. If people really truly believe that the Israelis were engaged in some kind of a catastrophically cruel, wanton war of unnecessary cruelty amounting to a genocide, um, wouldn't you then also ask Hamas to return the hostages that are the thing that keeps motivating the Israelis to keep going after Hamas and looking for Hamas, and that kept the Israeli street supporting huge chunks of it, supporting the war? In other words, Hamas did not behave. It held on to hostages. It held on to its policy of tormenting Israeli society with its by taking those hostages throughout the war. It did not behave as though it viewed the Israelis as motivated by those kinds of motives that people accuse Israel of being motivated by. And now they're playing another game. Once again, they're only ever playing these games. And this is sort of the defining policy of Hamas. It's beyond a trick, a strategy. It is what Hamas is. They are now letting the bodies out slowly. The Israelis have said this is intentional, this is purposeful. They are always, whenever you make an agreement with Hamas, it reaches the edge of breaking the agreement, breaks the agreement, but before it's worth it to you to then shatter everything and go back on your own half, then they come in and fulfill it. They're always stretching those boundaries. And what we've seen here is actually they've done it in a very interesting way. Essentially, what they've done is they trickle out the bodies enough, one or two a day, to always still be within the first phase of the hostage releases, of the hostage
Mhm.
returning of these bodies. And they're dragging out that first phase. They're dragging out very, very slowly that phase of we're still returning the bodies, we're still returning the bodies. Now, why do they want to stretch this out? Obviously, to torture Israeli families. Obviously, they take joy in it, they say so. But there's a strategy here. And the strategy is essentially what they're concerned about is the beginning of phase two. Phase two in Trump's peace plan is the beginning of places like, according to, I think it's Article 13 in the plan, the tunnels have to be destroyed. Article, I believe, 2, people can look it up. I think it's Article 2, Hamas has to disarm. All of that swings into action after phase one with the hostage release. And so Hamas are playing a game in which they're stretching out the hostage release longer and longer and longer to avoid reaching phase two. And what are they doing with that extra time? Essentially, what we've seen is the consolidation of the power of their power and the killing of all possible opposition people, critics on social media, not just clans and people who worked with the Israelis, which is what they claimed they were doing. They were killing random Palestinians who had criticized them on social media and then uploading themselves the videos of that online as a message to Palestinian society: we're here, we're back, we're in charge. Don't you
Mhm.
dare question that, despite the last 2 years of war. And so they're using this delay essentially to open that time window to retake their half of Gaza, reestablish themselves, and prepare to basically fight against the implementation of pretty much everything else in the Trump plan: the disarmament, the destruction of the tunnels, um, all the things that are actually in the Trump plan necessary for the rebuilding of Gaza.
If their strategy is to make this as long and painful as possible, do you think, I mean, today it was announced that 2, deceased hostages should be coming home. Do you think that that's the direct product of the strikes in the past few days?
I think that Hamas doesn't want the ceasefire to break
Mhm,
up. If the thing that will make the Israelis walk away from it is if the bodies stop coming out. And so
mhm,
yes, it's absolutely committed to the ceasefire, and the Israelis are absolutely committed to the ceasefire. It's a similar story in Lebanon. If the Israelis are continuing to suppress Hezbollah in Lebanon, why is Hezbollah agreeing to the ceasefire? And the simple answer is it wants the ceasefire to continue. It cannot afford to return to a situation in which Israel isn't limited in the ways
mhm.
that it is limited under the ceasefire. This is a with the exception of the families waiting for the bodies of their loved ones to get a proper burial. This is a comfortable situation for Israel, and it's worth saying also it's a disastrous situation for Gaza. Gaza is now a place where the Arab world, the ones who oppose the kind of radical version of Muslim Brotherhood Salafism that Hamas represents, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Moroccans, the Jordanians, desperately want to come into Gaza to begin the rebuilding, to begin the de-radicalization of the education system that Hamas built for 17 years,
Right.
and they really want to come in. The Europeans, the Americans want to invest massively. Somebody's got to send in 1 million tons of concrete into Gaza, or whatever the number is, an enormous amount, to do the actual beginning of the rebuilding. Gaza is a paradise waiting to happen. It is. We've talked about this. There's a huge natural gas reserve off Gaza's territorial waters. Nothing prevents a massive rebuilding of Gaza into what is essentially a wealthy and happy emirate on the Mediterranean. Nothing prevents that except the fact that Hamas has now retaken the place and is continuing to play its games to survive as an organization, to survive in power in Gaza, and to basically continue its forever war, its religious war for the eradication of Israel. Not a please, go to Hamas's charter. Don't believe me. I'm an Israeli Jew. I should just say that ahead of time. Not a war to end occupation or military rule in the West Bank and establish Palestinian independence. A war to eradicate Israel, for which they're willing to sacrifice Palestinian independence to states. That just is not what interests them. And
And the
so,
idea
yes,
is the idea is
yeah,
no country is gonna send in any form of technocratic governance or peacekeepers if they think that those people will be immediately in a firefight with Hamas. And so their
right.
arrival is totally contingent on the disarmament of Hamas. I mean, do you agree with that
Yeah, no,
characterization?
well, we've seen. I think that's absolutely right, and every American listening to us right now, I feel as though if Americans went in and
Mhm.
Hamas began to kill them while pretending that it isn't Hamas, it's somebody else, um, after the first American soldier to die, the second, the third, at some point the Americans are just going to say, I'm not bleeding and spending to save Gaza from a Hamas that Gaza itself is refusing to save itself from, or just literally to save Gaza from Hamas is not something I'm willing to sacrifice my boys for. And I would have tremendous respect for that view. I mean, I sympathy and I understand it. And it's also it's worth saying, I actually think the ceasefire is incredibly strong and incredibly robust and unlikely to break. And I mean that for two reasons. I don't think war is returning. I don't think it's returning for two reasons. One is external, namely the Trump administration. They really don't want the war to return. They are done. Their thinking about it is actually extraordinarily clever and interesting. J.D. Vance was here after President Trump, and one of the things J.D. Vance said, which I found really fascinating, he was asked about the continuation of the expansion of the Abraham Accords, and he said that, yeah, the Trump administration is definitely doubling down on that. Everybody's looking to the Saudis, the Indonesians. We all want to expand the Abraham Accord. And then he explained why. And then you caught a whiff of the isolationism wing of the Republican Party in the vice president, but it was an isolationism that favors large Middle Eastern alliances between the Israelis and the conservative moderate Sunnis. So he said, it's time for the countries of the Middle East, the powers of the Middle East, to take care of their own backyard. We want stability in the Middle East. Forgive me, I'm paraphrasing, but you can look up his comments. We
Mhm.
want stability in the Middle East, and that means we need Middle Easterners to. We don't want America involved. We don't want America spending and bleeding in the Middle East, and that means that to have stability, Middle Easterners have to step up. Now, who's going to step up to guarantee stability in the Middle East? The people who have that interest. And so you have these moderate regimes, the Gulf states, the Moroccans, etc., and Israel. And that alliance is an alliance that, in J.D. Vance's perspective, allows America to pull back and not be so invested in this region in ways that are not helpful or healthy or cheap, frankly, for America. So we have that pressure on the Trump administration. The second source of pressure is the Israeli public. Um, the ceasefire, I believe, has been in place since October 10, maybe October 9.
Mhm.
And there was a poll that week, the previous week, in which 70% of the Israeli public wanted to end the war, did not understand why the war was continuing, did not think, different people had different views, but they were this array of views, did not think this government of Israel knew how to finish the war successfully, how to defeat Hamas, as Netanyahu said, and wanted the war to end. When the war ended, Netanyahu's own polling rose among the Israeli public. There is while soldiers were going into Gaza telling themselves that they're going in to rescue hostages, you could still get massive call-ups of reservists into Gaza. Now that our hostages are back, now that that part has been front-loaded, Mati Friedman said this last time on the last live stream with the Free Press. That psychological knot has been loosened. That Israelis breathe freer now. Our people are no longer in the dungeons of Hamas, and now families in Israel don't know why their fathers, sons, brothers are going to go back into Gaza into a violent, terrible, awful guerrilla war to what? Sort of figure out a way to defeat Hamas, rescue Gaza from Hamas, give Netanyahu the victory he needs for his political base after promising total victory all these 2 years, not for reasons that are worth the lives of our family members. And so there is
Well,
this very powerful resistance in the Israeli public right now, including on the
mhm,
right. 70% means it goes deep into Netanyahu's base to go back to the war. So for those reasons, the ceasefire, I think, it's going to hold. It's very
mhm.
strong, but it's going to look like South Lebanon.
Well, the only question I think people might have is there a case that IDF soldiers should go into the Hamas-controlled 47% to try to retrieve the remaining hostages? And, some additional elements I'll put onto this is, like, what incentive does Hamas have at this point to hand over all of the hostages? And what happens when Hamas has no deceased hostage left? And so, I mean, I'm curious your perspective here, because on one hand, does it make
Yeah.
sense to send a living soldier to rescue a deceased hostage? That's a different calculus than sending a living soldier to rescue a living hostage. Um,
Yeah, it
and
doesn't make sense to me.
okay.
Hamas is continuing to release the hostages because if it doesn't, I do think that this look, the government of Netanyahu has shown that it is capable of sticking it out against unbelievable pressure, international and domestic, if Netanyahu believes that that's what's necessary. Is a return to war possible in terms of Israeli politics? Yes, it is emphatically possible. I've described all the reasons why I think Netanyahu's preference is not to return to war, for domestic reasons, for international reasons. He really, really would like his legacy to be the Abraham Accords. That can't happen as long as Gaza is continuing to be an arena of war. But
And
he
there's,
will, yeah,
there seems to be some progress on Indonesia, Syria, Saudi. I mean, it's not so far out of
yeah,
the realm of possibility in the next few years. So,
yeah, or in the next few months. It's not
mhm,
at all out of the realm of possibility, with the caveat that Hamas still rules half of Gaza now, has retaken half of Gaza, and so Gaza is not going to become a peaceful place for that reason. It's going to be extremely hard to do that. Um, Also, the fight to sort of rebuild Gaza is itself going to be a fight between different camps in the Middle East. The Saudis would like to lead a kind of de-radicalization conservative Sunni version of the rebuilding of Gaza. The
mhm,
Turks, who are led by Erdogan's AKP party, which is a kind of sister party ideologically to Hamas. They're very much in the sort of Salafist Muslim Brotherhood kind of theological lineage as Hamas is. They would like to be the major force leading the rebuilding of Gaza. The Israelis are dead set against that at the moment, because if the Turkish army goes into Gaza, it will
mhm.
not function as an army meant to build a Gaza that is free of Hamas, or that is only allows a political Hamas but not a military Hamas. It will actually be it will defend Hamas. It will
And,
prevent the
and I
Israelis from being able to go after Hamas.
one
Yeah.
important element, and please correct me if you feel like my characterization is off, is that Erdogan is sympathetic to the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
And
Yeah.
I mean, one would say as is Qatar. So it's like the money from
Yes.
the Emiratis, um, is pocketed in a different light than the money from Qatar and the Muslim Brotherhood, because that money has ideological baggage, so to say. Would you say that's right?
Yeah, although, Qatar is still very much Muslim Brotherhood. That is still the version of Islam that it espouses.
Yeah.
It agrees with Hamas's eschatology and view of the world and willingness to fight particular wars.
Mhm.
But they're sick of this war, and they feel the war could come home to them. That's something that the Israeli strike in Doha, I think, drove home. And they, after that strike, sought protection from Trump. Trump gave them that protection we've talked about this, with an executive order saying that CENTCOM will defend them militarily. That's a very significant statement, because CENTCOM is the United States military. In other words, is really the only military in the region that can even see the Israelis coming. And so they're protecting Qatar now, which makes Qatar a safe place from an Israeli airstrike. It also means Hamas's leadership is safe only as long as it's in Doha, only as long as it's in Qatar, which is a massive Trump massively increased Qatar's leverage over the Hamas leadership, because if they kick them out, the Israelis will go after them. And so Qatar is, the very fact that 2 days ago at the Council of Foreign Relations in
Yeah.
Washington, the Qatari foreign minister, not the Emirati foreign minister that hate Hamas anyway, and the Muslim Brotherhood are illegal in the Emirates and in Saudi Arabia, but the Qatari foreign minister, whose basic Islam is Muslim Brotherhood Islam, the fact that he would say this is Hamas's fault, Hamas broke the ceasefire, we need Hamas to get back on track, is a significant statement of distance. I don't think that's true of the Turks. And if the Turks come into Gaza, Hamas will be not distanced from government in Gaza, not be fought back to allow a de-radicalization of the education system in Gaza, but in fact the opposite. The Turks will restore Hamas in power in Gaza, function as human shields for Hamas intentionally, and Gaza will remain what it is, and it'll be much harder to rebuild, and it'll be harder for it to have a new day.
Well, I think, and we've sort of been dancing around this, but one major element here is that inside of Gaza, the territory is split between what Hamas controls and what the IDF controls. And the reason I bring that up is to say all of the rebuilding effort is presumably only going to happen on the IDF controlled territory. Do you agree with that?
I think I think you've just touched on the issue that, to me at least, as I understand what's happening in Gaza right now, is the single most important issue for the future of Gaza.
Mm,
David Petraeus had this idea in Iraq of the Disneyland strategy of setting up exemplary models of cooperation and prosperity with local forces and allowing food in and commerce in and a rebuilding. And because in certain areas under, I don't know what, U.S. military collaboration, control, cooperation, they would be built up because the Iraqis would see that, and they would see that places controlled by the Sadarite militias were not. That would separate the hearts and minds. That would separate the civilian population, their hearts and minds, from the militias that the U.S., the insurgents that the U.S. was fighting. That was the strategy. It was extraordinarily successful at various points in the Iraq War and in the Iraq occupation. J.D. Vance talked that way when he visited.
Mhm.
And Israeli officials over the past week, if you Google it, you'll find it. There are Israeli officials, not yet, in public, not yet by name, but leaking to journalists anonymously, but nevertheless, actual sitting Israeli officials thinking in these terms. In the behind the yellow line, as it's called, that's the withdrawal line of the Israeli forces inside Gaza. Behind the yellow line, there's no reason. The Israeli officials told journalists 2 days ago not to have the rebuilding begin fast, expedited, and in a place totally controlled by the IDF, meaning it's the IDF's allies, it's Israel's
Mhm.
allies, it's the conservative moderates rather than the radical jihadi regimes of the Middle East doing it. The Turks don't get to step foot in there. Israel itself can be part of the major rebuilding project. If the IDF is smart enough, if the IDF, it's not a decision of the IDF, if the Israeli government is smart enough to do that, half of Gaza does get rebuilt behind the IDF lines. The only condition is that de radicalization and the removal of Hamas. Then Hamas will rule over a half of Gaza that its own rule will keep poor and demolished. And that is a fantastic way forward that clarifies to Gazans the cost of Hamas and also offers the thing that the Israeli government struggled to offer, and we at the Free Press have criticized them repeatedly over the last 2 years on this, have
Mhm.
struggled to offer, which is that new day, that promise of a
Well,
different, better future with Hamas gone.
well, right now, where are most of Gazan civilians? On what side of the line?
There are hundreds of thousands on both sides. I don't
On
know
both.
the exact numbers. There are hundreds of thousands in Gaza City, which is very much within the Hamas side
Mhm.
of the line. But there are sections and
The
tent encampments also on the Israeli side. But we
the
can look
reason
that up.
the reason I ask is because for all the Gazan civilians on the Hamas-controlled side, presumably there are some that, will see, as Amit Siegel would say, the Emirati-built schools and all of the, the funding coming into the other side and want to move over, and the challenge will be, will Hamas let them cross over into the IDF-controlled territory? And so seems like a really intractable challenge, and I'm curious how you think that that could play out.
Just speaking militarily, I mean, we're describing here the suffering of civilians. Just in terms of military strategy, if that were to begin, that would be very good news because it would mean that the Israelis were succeeding in that rebuilding on the Israeli side, and it would also mean that it's an opportunity for the Israelis to, frankly, just film Hamas forcibly shooting or setting up checkpoints to prevent Gazans from leaving. At the beginning of the war, if you remember, the very first Israeli entry into Gaza City, long before the IDF adopted the demolition strategy to get to the tunnels, where it was urban warfare. It was terrible, it was disastrous, but it wasn't the demolition we saw beginning with Rafah when they really had to seal up 1,500 tunnels that crisscross under that city between Palestinian Rafah and Egyptian Rafah, from which Hamas was resupplying over the course of the first few months of the war. Um, Gazans fled. The IDF announced that it was coming in, it announced which neighborhoods it was coming into, and Gazans began to leave those neighborhoods. And Hamas set up checkpoints and opened fire on
Right.
civilians to prevent it from happening.
Right.
And that has happened repeatedly at different points when Hamas felt that the civilians staying in the war zone was a priority. Um, there's no reason to think it won't happen again.
Mm.
And if the Israelis are competent, they'll film it happening. And under the aegis of Israeli control, Israeli military control, but basically American Saudi combined control governed by Tony Blair. I mean, that's what the Trump plan um, envisions. It envisions a very broad international coalition of parties that Israel desperately needs. It needs America. It needs the Saudis. It hungers for an expansion and normalization of the Saudis, which is massive leverage for Gazans, because it means that Israel has a very good reason, an enormous carrot holding it at the table and keeping that rebuilding going. In that world, in that half, if the Israelis can really push this, then the whole narrative of the war. I don't know
Mhm.
if the narrative of the war in the for activists in Holland will change, but the narrative of the war on the ground for Gazans and the narrative of the war for Israelis, I think, would be fundamentally altered.
Do you think the yellow line becomes a lasting border of sorts? Are you seeing it as a temporary fixture? And the reason I say is, there's the green line around the West Bank, the blue line between Israel and Lebanon, the purple line against Syria. And now we have this yellow line um, splitting up Gaza. And I think a lot of onlookers are thinking, is this a temporary line or is this sort of the new border? How are you thinking about it going into the future?
I honestly can't say. We have seen lines come and go,
Mhm.
and we have seen lines stick around for generations. And both were said to be temporary, and both were the exigencies of some military conflict of a few days or a few weeks. There in this region, the informal, the temporary, can become very long lasting and formal and permanent in everything but name. I'll just say, I don't think Israel wants to end up with Gaza. I don't think the Israeli public wants to. We have polls, depending on how you ask the question. If the question is, if we can't get rid of Hamas militarily, should we just take half of Gaza? You'll get quite a few Israelis saying yes. But if you say, do you want to gain control of Gaza in this war? The vast majority of Israelis will say no,
Well,
which
one
tells me that there's a deep there isn't any support really for holding
Mhm.
on to Gaza in the Israeli political world,
I mean,
and so
some
I
lis
don't think it'll be permanent.
See, I apologize to cut you off. A lot of I just want to say a lot of listeners are writing in saying, "Why shouldn't the IDF take control of more of Gaza to allow for this development that we're talking about in a broader area? What's the rationale for staying at the current yellow line?" That was Glenn who wrote in that question.
Yeah.
And I mean, you're saying there doesn't seem to be Israeli appetite, but are there other reasons outside of that?
As far as I understand it, the yellow line is a line that the IDF itself believed was a good defensible line from which it can continue to pursue Hamas, but also end the war. So it's a ceasefire line that makes sense militarily on the ground. It's a buffer against the Israel-Gaza border all around Gaza, and it allows the IDF in the places that really matter, such as the Gaza-Egypt border, the northern Gaza, to continue to pursue tunnels and to find those tunnels.
Mhm.
It's a line the IDF chose, and so that it makes sense just in terms of tactics on the ground at this moment.
Ano-
Um, yeah,
Another listener wrote in a similar question, which is, to what extent are the Hamas tunnels on the Israeli side of the demarcation a danger? Um, and I'll tack on, just the other day speaking with Yaakov Katz, one of the issues in carrying out this war is that the IDF didn't really know the extent to the tunnel structure under Gaza prior to the war, and even still to this day are still discovering new tunnels. So my assumption is that
yeah.
it's a little hard to say, but from your understanding, what do we know about the tunnel structure that's intact in the 53% IDF controlled territory?
Huge sections, hundreds of
Mhm.
kilometers have been destroyed. They're still finding them. Gaza sits on very soft sandstone. It is extremely easy to dig new tunnels in Gaza. It's just it's a part of the geography. It's extremely hard to dig a tunnel underneath Jerusalem, for example, because it's essentially a kind of bedrock. It's this limestone mountains, but atop of very hard rock that's not that deep. Gaza, it's very easy, extremely easy. We have to assume, and I think the Israelis assume this, that Hamas is already now at work digging tunnels. If it wants to carry out operations on the Israeli side of the yellow line a year from now, it's probably already got people starting the mapping out of new tunnels that they're going to be digging onto the Israeli side to carry out those operations. There isn't, they are absolutely a danger. They will remain a danger. They're not going anywhere unless Gaza actually demilitarizes from Hamas. Uh, this never ends.
There was
And
another oh,
yeah,
sorry. Another reader wrote in, referencing a Jerusalem Post report that basically said there was an ATV stolen from one of the Gaza border communities and then taken into Gaza, again showing that the border was presumably breached. Did you see this reporting at all?
I saw some message, some note about it. I have no, I can't verify the
Mhm.
story. I also, I'm not sure it means too much. There are
Okay.
in the Negev, in southern Israel, fairly significant criminal crime families, and mostly engaged in smuggling across the Egypt-Israel border, and also smuggling into Gaza. And some of these Bedouin crime families routinely, literally just syndicates that just deal with stealing and of cars. Of I once parked down south, and my motorcycle was stolen. This is 20 years ago. I'm over it, but I went to the police. I filed a complaint. The police explained to me that they have some reason to believe that they have seen the motorcycle going into the Bedouin city of Rahat down south, where some of these syndicates operate. So I
Mhm.
said, "Great, so let's go get it." And they said, "No, we don't do that. That would be a gun battle." So, so that kind of lawlessness and that kind of organized crime might be what we're seeing there. There are a lot of Bedouin IDF soldiers serving in
In
Gaza who, if they're part of
including
a syndicate,
including the ATV moving back into Gaza.
yes, where it's either sold or that some member of the syndicate who's in the IDF might be part of it. The Bedouin are Israelis. Some of them serve in the IDF. Some of them are quite patriotic Israelis, and also very closely connected to the clans and clan structures in Gaza, and also to Bedouin clans in the Sinai Desert in Egypt. And there's this whole second world, parallel world, which I just described some of the criminal aspects of it. It's not just criminal; it's a cultural world, also of communication. And ever since drones came into to existence and became accessible, drones have been ferrying a lot of this smuggling across these borders. So I suspect that's the story, and I can't find any detailed confirmation from police or anything like that to
But
fully verify.
does it worry you about the sanctity of the border and the border security itself?
No,
Okay.
no, because what it would mean would be that that Israeli elements, actors using soldiers that are part of a crime network. Yes, it's bad that there are crime networks. It's bad that they're soldiers. It's bad that they're smuggling. But it's
Mhm.
not. It doesn't represent a Hamas infrastructure penetrating the IDF defenses of the Israeli border, which would be a strategic problem and a military problem and potentially blow up the ceasefire. I don't think it represents that. I think it represents something much more quotidian and much less interesting. Unless
Mhm.
television tells us that organized crime is extremely interesting. So in that sense, it's interesting.
We've spoken obviously about the skirmishes between Hamas and IDF in Gaza, the demarcation splitting up Gaza into these two sections. What do we know about anti-Hamas Palestinian factions within Gaza reacting to Hamas's violations of the ceasefire agreement and this new world of two states within Gaza?
Great question. Most of them, especially obviously if they're on the Hamas side of the yellow line, have gone completely quiet.
Mm,
Completely quiet. They are, their heads down. They've allowed Hamas to take over. Some of the big clans have lost some of the big gun battles to Hamas. Dozens killed, by the way, women and children. And now they've basically agreed to dismantle. Behind the Israeli line, you have clans holding their own. Abu Shabab is one example, but there are others. The big question is if clans are useful administrative tools, administrative infrastructures, unless Hamas goes after them, then they're not actually useful because the whole point the hope the IDF had, or the hope the Israelis had for the clans was that they were the next governance structure. Um, Local, domestic, born out of Gaza, containing Gazans, willing to fight for the future of Gaza, sick and tired of the endless wars that Hamas drags Gaza into. That's how the Dulmush clan, for example, talked about it. They never agreed to work with the Israelis or take guns from the Israelis, but they did criticize Hamas, and Hamas went after them in bloody, bloody purges. So it turns out that those clans are much, much less useful because they collapse under the weight of a Hamas offensive. And so the investment in them, the hopes for them, I think, have been basically. I haven't asked the right Israeli officials these questions to know if this is literally the thinking, but I don't hear anyone talking about them as the future anymore, which was something you were hearing a month ago. So I think basically the hope for them has been dashed.
One question about all of the interlocutors surrounding Hamas, and then I do want to go to the West Bank. You know, what do you think Egypt and Turkey and Qatar are saying to Hamas right now as the situation unfolds? Obviously, we have this one data point of Qatari prime minister saying that Hamas violated um, the ceasefire and other remarks that he said at CFR, which were quite illuminating. What do you think they're saying to Hamas directly?
There are two wars. There's a war on the ground and there's an information war. I think that there is a sense by a great many Middle Easterners that Hamas won a very, very important victory in returning the Palestinian question, the Palestinian issue, squarely onto the world's agenda. And that the information war, in that sense, has been dramatically won by Hamas. For those governments, not all of them are happy about it. In other words, for some of them, that's a very destabilizing thing to have happened. The Jordanian king faces a real threat by the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan, which are now being financed by Iran, among others, to destabilize Jordan. Iran started doing this 2 years ago when Jordan helped shoot down the missile attacks on Israel. The Egyptians are terrified of a Muslim Brotherhood return. The Muslim Brotherhood rule in Egypt was only stopped by Sisi's military coup back in what was it, 2013. And so this sense that what Hamas represents, what Hamas is the spearhead of in the region, the forces in the region that it represents, are now on the march in the hearts and minds of Middle Easterners, is not going to hurt Israel. Israel shattered its many enemies and arrays of enemies, and enemies who had been building military capabilities to destroy it for 3 decades, but it's quite powerfully and dangerously destabilizing for some of the Middle Eastern governments. And so, what they want, what they're pressuring Hamas to do, is to take this whole issue, this whole, I would say, radicalizing issue for many, many Arab populations off the table. The Saudis wanted to go away, the Emiratis wanted to go away because it strengthens the forces of radical Islam that they see as a mortal threat to them and have been trying to suppress and push back on throughout the region for a long time. It's been interesting to see the Qataris join that crowd because the Qataris have always been on the radical Islamic side. Al Jazeera has always trumpeted people like Yusuf al Qaradawi for years and years and decades. But they now also are afraid of the instability itself. And so I think that a lot of groups, a lot of forces, some of them supporting Hamas, are now telling Hamas the region is destabilizing, stop it. And I think that is basically what you're seeing. The only other point that the reason that Hamas went to this ceasefire is that their last sanctuary, the last place where the Israelis were not systematically in control, and where Hamas still had a massive network of tunnels stretching into probably hundreds of kilometers, was Gaza City. And Hamas agreed to the ceasefire by the time the Israeli army was already halfway in to the municipal boundaries of Gaza City. Um, so Hamas, I think, was worried about actually facing the last refuge being lost in Gaza, the last sanctuary underground, and its allies, even its allies, want to return to stability in the region.
Let's go to the West Bank for a few. As this tenuous situation regarding the ceasefire plays out in Gaza, on the other side, the Knesset voted basically to advance a bill that would apply, and a lot of people felt like this was symbolic, that can be debated, but to apply Israeli sovereignty to the West Bank. The Trump administration was obviously quite upset about this. That seemed like a red line on the American side. Can you tell us about this legislation and what it meant?
Yeah, it was purely a declaratory resolution. It was in the sense that I believe it was the preliminary. A piece of legislation has to be voted on, has to pass the Knesset plenum vote 3 times before it becomes law. Um, this wasn't even the first time, if I'm not mistaken. It was the pre-vote to come up for the first vote of those 3 votes. And it was clear to, and Netanyahu said, I don't want it, and Likud was not going to vote for it. And actually, many of the coalition members walked out, and some opposition members, ironically, because there's some right wingers in the opposition, voted for the piece of legislation, and then it moved forward. And it really was just a declaration. Some of the members of the opposition wanted it to pass because they wanted to embarrass the coalition members who refused to vote for it. It was just nothing but pure political wrangling. And
What
JD Vance was in the
practical
region.
I guess
Yeah,
just, like, really dumb it down for me and for other people who don't follow this particular piece as closely. What practical effect does it actually have on the ground in the West Bank?
zero.
Zero.
It never passed as legislation. It was
Right.
a
And
declaration of an intent to, yeah.
even if it had passed, what practical effect would it have had?
I don't think it actually changes anything on the ground.
Okay.
If it had passed, first of all, it would have been a Knesset demanding a fundamental change in policy, so it would have had an effect.
Mhm.
But after a first vote, it goes back to committees, and then it's written up, and if it can't get out of committee, it's dead, and then it has to go back to the plenum, and then there's two more votes. We're nowhere near. I mean, thousands of pieces of legislation have been passed in the preliminary vote,
Mhm.
just as essentially a press release by a member of Knesset who wants to show their voters they're doing something. That's what this was. And it was a stunt. And JD Vance said, when asked about it, it was a stunt. And I'm kind of personally insulted that while the vice president of the United States is visiting, the Israeli Knesset will pull a stunt like that where it will talk publicly, brazenly about annexation in the West Bank, something the Trump administration is dead set against, and was really going to bat for Israel to get Israel's interests looked out for in the ceasefire, etc.
Mhm.
Um,
I guess my
I'll just
question
say
is it
I
I'm
kind
sorry.
of shared JD Vance's assessment. It was nothing but internal Israeli wrangling for various little bases to put out little press releases, and done in a way that embarrassed the vice president of the United States when he was visiting. I think his critique was absolutely correct.
So even though it was purely symbolic, the understanding that the White House was so shocked and upset by it was because it was embarrassing, even though everyone kind of understood that it was symbolic. And just to tack on, Axios's Barack Ravid basically told a U.S. official, or excuse me, a U.S. official told him, and he reported this quote from this U.S. official, unnamed, which was Netanyahu is walking a fine line with the president, of course, regarding the West Bank. If he keeps going, he'll F up the Gaza deal. His language was stronger than how I'm going to relay it now. If he Fs up the deal, Donald Trump will F him. So clearly there was like no one minced words. Um,
I have no idea. Every leak that comes to Barack Ravid, I think he's a good journalist doing good journalistic work. But the people who talk to Barack Ravid are the people who want to say that in the administration. It never comes to
mm,
Barack Ravid that Trump actually thinks Netanyahu did a great job last week and they're really good friends. That's never the leak. That's a leak to other people. When you come to Barack Ravid from the Trump administration, that's what you're saying. And so that was one of the views expressed in the Trump administration. I have no idea. I don't know. Other people, the Free Press, will do a much better job than me in knowing in Washington, in the White House, the different perspectives. Netanyahu didn't want this piece of legislation. Nevertheless, the members of parliament of Israel were irresponsible and stupid and only focused on their own little narrow domestic bases and wrangling in ways that slightly, very slightly. I think the Americans were adult about it. I don't think anybody took it too seriously. But nevertheless, it was a public embarrassment for the vice president while he was visiting. The vice president, who, by the way, has a double-digit percent chance of being the next U.S. president. Why would the Israelis play those kinds of games? And the answer is that sometimes we're led by a bunch of incompetent fools.
well,
I
at the
can't
same time,
really defend it any other way. I don't. Yeah.
there's this internal politicking, as we're talking about in the Knesset and in the White House, over these symbolic gestures. But at the same time, there were these really unsettling videos that were coming out of the West Bank of settler attacks, clubbing Palestinians in the West Bank. And it was brutal to watch. And, I guess the question is, what should be done about that? What can Trump do, and what should be done within Israeli politics?
Yes, that has to be something that the Israelis address in a very serious way. And the refusal to address it, mainly because of coalition politics, Netanyahu can't afford to lose the great protector of the most extreme edges of that movement, which is Itamar Ben-Gvir. The refusal to address it is going to hurt Israel. And And it's one of those situations where everybody's got a data point to hold on to believe that they're right. Defenders, either of the settlement movement, this is really a fringe of the fringe of actual Israelis living over the Green Line. But nevertheless, it is a fringe that nobody's cracking down on, and that already makes it something that the entire state needs to can be held accountable for. The simple fact is that this has been going on. It is absolutely terroristic. It is terrorism. It is I don't I in my naivete still cling to an actual definition of terrorism. If you attack soldiers, you're not terrorist. You're just at war. That's war. That's not terror. You might be a saboteur. You might be a guerrilla fighter. You're not a terrorist. Terrorism is attacking civilians, specifically civilians, targeting civilians, targeting them specifically for political ends. That is the FBI definition, and I like it, and I'm going to stick to it. This extremist Israeli violence is terroristic in that sense, and it is pure in that sense. And if the Israelis don't come crashing down on it when it is at its current size, which is not a massive phenomenon in the West Bank yet, it is growing, and it has been growing. And the refusal to crack down on it means that it will get bigger, and the cost to Israel will grow. And any Israeli official who thinks they can sit this one out and not crack down on it in a serious way is bringing on Israel the very great cost. Never mind that they're literally just breaking their own fundamental moral obligations to law and order for Palestinians and for Israelis. They are also bringing on Israel greater costs in the future, and a lot of times that is how Israeli governance works. It's not always a very competent state in terms of domestic issues and problems of that kind. So yes, it's terrorism, and the Israelis have to get their act in order to deal with it. And if they don't, they will reap what they sow.
I want to talk about what the US response should be. During the administration, he had put forward an executive order that basically allowed the US to impose sanctions on Israelis disturbing peace in the West Bank due to the surge of settler violence that you and I are speaking about. Obviously, we're talking about this one specific case. It's not the only case. Trump revoked that order once he got into office. I guess in two parts, why did Trump revoke the order, do you think? And what should the Trump administration do now to crack down on what we're talking about?
Yeah, I can't speak to why the revoking that specific revocation happened. I would say that what we have generally seen is that because of polarization that has nothing to do with Israel in America between American political factions, every time a new president from a different party comes in, they basically wipe out everything the previous president did. I mean, Biden could not continue with the Abraham Accords and advance it for 2.5 years of his presidency simply because it was identified with Trump. And by the time he got around to it, because he was looking for a legacy, October 7 basically torpedoed his ability to move forward on that. And when Trump came into office in his first term, he was kind of talked to himself about being the anti-Obama, and now Trump is basically changed the American domestic politics have cannibalized American foreign policy to some significant extent. And that means that the foreign policy itself isn't always thought out. It's just how do I not allow whatever the last guy did? How do I dismantle that? So I'm not 100% clear on specifically the details of any particular decision to revoke those decisions. What should the Trump administration do going forward? One of the one of the strengths of the Trump administration in the Middle East, it really has gone from one astonishing success to another, from the Abraham Accords to the ceasefire to a bear hug of Israel alongside a bear hug of Qatar, and these two countries that are on opposite sides of the most fundamental ideological divide in the Middle East are now pushing in the same direction and coordinating with each other very carefully because they both need America. That way of behaving is unique to the Trump administration. That sense that everything is transactional is extremely natural in the Middle East. It's how the Middle East thinks of itself anyway, and it comes very naturally to the Trump administration. So it has been very successful thus far, and I think that that's basically how you approach it with the Israelis. If Trump gets sick and tired of this happening, I'm sick and tired of it happening as an Israeli. I demand from my government to deal with it seriously. I
Mhm.
wrote a demand like that 10 years ago in an essay, but okay, apparently they don't listen to Haviv. It would be great if the Trump administration came forward and said, fix this. We're sick and tired of it. It hurts you, it hurts us. It undermines every ally you want to have. It gets on Saudi media. The Al Jazeera broadcasts it out to the Arab world. What's wrong with you? Why would this be allowed to happen? Fix it. And I think that that would have an effect.
You've said in this conversation that, you know, well, let me put it this way. Do you think that the ceasefire and the future of the 20-point plan is contingent on actually these other questions that are happening in the West Bank? Can you basically draw the link between the two?
No, I don't think so.
No. Okay.
Um, I put it this way, I hope not. Um, when you're trying to move forward in the Middle East on something, including in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but also in Syria, Yemen, Lebanon, it doesn't matter where you are. When you try to move forward on something, you want the fewest possible dependent variables. Okay, so if you want, I don't know what, the Lebanese state to be in full rule in Lebanon and sovereign over its territory, and Hezbollah disarmed, and the Lebanese army being the army of Lebanon, the only armed force in Lebanon. Let's say you want that as a goal. That is the declared American goal, the international goal, the French goal, and the Lebanese government's own goal. If you then make it dependent on what Syria wants and dependent on what Iran wants, and to bring everybody to the table and give more and more people a veto over that happening, then you are making sure it can never happen.
Mhm.
If you make the future prosperity and rebuilding of Gaza dependent on stability in the West Bank, on West Bank Hamas cells not igniting a war, on Itamar Ben Gvir not radicalizing some, I don't know what, pushing some explosion of tension in the West Bank in some way, which he has the leverage to do as a minister of government. On anybody who wants to, who does not want the Trump vision for Gaza, if you let them have that veto power over Gaza, Gaza will not move forward in the direction the Trump administration has articulated, which is an extraordinary and good direction. So I hope they're smart enough to detach those things.
Mm.
And they
But
can
but I guess
detach
I
those
guess
things.
the
The territories
question
themselves don't need each other to move forward.
I guess the question though is the assumption is that the deal only works if there's buy-in from Americans and from the Arab partners. And both the Americans and the Arab partners seem to have stake and care in what's happening in the West Bank. So is it possible to actually parse out those two sentiments?
I hope so.
Okay.
I'm not telling anybody to ignore the West Bank, and I'm not saying that what happens with Israeli violence in the northern. By the way, there are clans. Basically, they're clans. It's a little complicated. Jenin is social in terms of the social structures of a city like Jenin in the northern West Bank. It functions differently than the way it functions in Gaza. But let's use just these sort of English words just to move forward in the conversation. You have these clans in Jenin that have taken over sections of the city and are deeply, deeply intertwined with Hamas, connected to Hamas, and some of them declare allegiance to ISIS. And they
Mhm.
launch attacks, and the Israeli army then moves in. If that happening in Jenin, and we've seen it happen multiple times over the last 2 years, um, is going to prevent moving forward in Gaza, then you're going to have. We already don't know if it's possible to build that Trump vision for Gaza in the Trump plan, rebuilding, natural gas, massive support of the Arab world, the Israelis pulling out and no annexation, no settlement by Israel. That is something Israel committed to in the Trump plan. That's one of the major markers in the Trump plan. All of that for Gaza, if you make it dependent on whether or not an ISIS affiliated militia in Jenin doesn't start a shooting battle with an IDF force in Jenin,
Mhm.
you've done something very bad for Gaza. Does that mean you should ignore Jenin? Absolutely not. But don't link them if you want Gaza to move forward. It's already going to be hard just in Gaza's terms to move Gaza forward.
Final question, Haviv. On that note, how much of the deal and the future of phase two, and even just the ceasefire staying in place, is contingent on US involvement? And I'm asking because Trump, we know him to be easily distracted. Even this week, he met with China's Xi Jinping in South Korea. China's very much priority on the American foreign policy agenda. This is expressed by Bridge Colby and so many others. Witkoff has said that he's likely to leave his role by the end of the year. So, what do you think happens when Witkoff leaves and Trump is busy with other foreign policy matters? How does that affect this playing out? And are you worried that things could fall apart if the US takes a step back?
This particular stage needs the Americans.
Mhm.
This stage where the Qataris and the Israelis, on opposite sides of the question of is Hamas a good thing or is Hamas's version of Islam good or bad, on opposite sides of these foundational, fundamental questions, um, this moment is really a moment being shepherded by the Americans, and I don't know that anyone else could have. I can't think of another way to have given A, pressured Qatar, B, terrified Qatar, and C, given Qatar the leverage over Hamas by making Qatar safe from Israeli attack, that allowed Qatar to force Hamas into a deal where all the living Israeli hostages are front loaded for the release and for the ceasefire. And that was what allowed Netanyahu, forced Netanyahu, opened up the political path in domestic Israeli politics for Netanyahu to end the war immediately. And so nobody could have done that except the Americans. Nobody was positioned to, nobody understood the region well enough to have done that, to have brought those players together in that way. There is a larger and longer term interests of people in the region that don't require the Americans. In fact, arguably, the Saudis and the Israelis need each other more if they can rely on America less. And so there's an order of operations here where this moment needs America utterly to bridge gaps that are not bridgeable within the Middle East. And the next moment, I think in America checking out will not ruin anything. It'll probably actually help advance things. By the way, from what I hear from Trump officials, they see it that way as well. And so they're not, if they do leave, that's not going to hurt things, but not right now. In a few months' time, when whatever international stabilization force in Gaza is a little bit stabilized, we already know that behind the yellow line there's going to be development. When that stuff moves forward, I think that the role of the Americans in this, the pivotal role of the Americans in this, will have ended.
Well, Haviv Rettig Gur, thank you so much for being generous with your time and for coming on the Free Press live stream today. His work is in our pages at thefp.com. And of course, if you're not already listening, please go listen to his podcast, Ask Haviv Anything. Haviv, thank you again.
Thanks, Rafaela.